And we're back on City News. David Coletto is going to join me in a little bit. We're going to be talking about federal politics and where Canadians are sort of seeing themselves. But I wanted to have this discussion today with Patrick Fafard. He is Senior Investigator, Global Strategy Lab, Professor, University of Ottawa, Faculty of Social Science and Faculty of Medicine. Hello, Patrick.
Good morning.
Patrick, we had a really thought-provoking conversation a couple of weeks ago in regards to Dr. Kieran Moore. And the fact that I was feeling, and I think many people are feeling, we don't see Dr. Moore as much as we did when even he was the medical officer of health for Kingston. When he seemed to go to the province, he seemed to not sort of be as accessible as he was in the past. And our topic today is sort of dovetails into that in terms of public health decisions and how we follow the science. Talk to me a little bit, Patrick, about this sort of notion of us following the science, because we've heard time and time again the Prime Minister, the Premier, of every Premier in this province say that especially during COVID, many of them were following the science.
You're exactly right. So most listeners will remember, particularly early on in the pandemic, we're talking February, March, April, May of 2020, Premier Ford and other politicians across the country would routinely say, today, my government is announcing X, and we're doing so because, on the advice of the chief medical officer, we're following the scientific advice that we've received. Therefore, we are doing thus and so. And so we were interested to find out at questions like, well, how common is this? Is it used in other countries? And with what effect? And so we just published a paper a couple weeks ago that gives the results. And what we found is that this strategy of claiming to be, quote, just following the science is incredibly common, but it's also incredibly problematic.
And the problems stem from?
Well, think about it for a second. We elect the government to make difficult decisions on our behalf and to say to the public, well, it's really not me who's deciding. I'm just following the advice of my scientific advisors. It displaces responsibility for the decision, right? It has the effect of saying, well, I didn't decide, or I decided based on this advice. And if you think about it for a second, it kind of makes no sense, because it's probably, well, we know it's not true, but second, we don't want it to be true. I don't want my politicians to be making a decision just on the basis of the public health advice. I want them to balance all the different things that people are concerned about, like, what do you mean you're closing my business? What do you mean you're mandating me to wear a mask? What do you mean I have to get vaccinated? So we want our politicians to do the really, really difficult job of balancing the science against all the other considerations. So to sort of claim, well, I'm just following the science, has the effect of shifting responsibility.
But let me ask you this. I mean, many politicians, and I have a lot of respect for people that put their name on a ballot and get elected. Do not misunderstand me. But also, some of these politicians don't have the expertise to be making those decisions. So are you suggesting that more stakeholders are brought into the conversation? So, let's talk a little bit about the business side of it, for instance, and the economy side. We know that closing businesses was detrimental to people, not only from a financial perspective, but from a mental health perspective. And although essentially, I truly believe, because I do believe the science, that there were people that probably had their lives saved, or because we did have to take quite extreme measures to ensure people were safe. Now, were they too extreme at times? Maybe so, but we can't rely on somebody that's just elected happens to get enough votes to be the sole decision maker either.
I would admit you're all right except to the right at the end. We can't rely on people who just elected. No, we must ask the people we elect to be the decision maker. We cannot rely on them to be all-knowing and all-knowledgeable and have all the necessary expertise and information and with which to make decisions. But they, at the end of the day, must make decisions. But
I've worked for many politicians over my time, Patrick, and I'll tell you, sometimes it's the last person that they talk to is the way that they end up going. So
exactly.
So that's where I find there's a flaw in that system.
So we have very elaborate mechanisms at the provincial and the federal level by which, before the minister or the premier and cabinet make a decision, we gather all the analysis and information together. The public service marshals it all in a particular way and says, in response to this problem, here's what we know, here are some options, here's a recommendation, go. And the minister typically makes a recommendation to cabinet colleagues, I think we should do this. In a crisis decision making, where all these kind of processes are truncated and things are moving very quickly, that process is not necessarily followed as quite as completely, but at a minimum, the idea is you assemble all the information. When Premier Ford said repeatedly, I'm making this controversial decision because I'm just following the science, or I'm just following the advice of Dr. Williams, or I'm just following the advice of Dr. Moore, it was as if all the other considerations were not important. But we know that's not true, because we know that the Ford government was often very late in ordering lockdowns in the fall of 2020, for example. Well, that was because they were doing what they were supposed to do. We may not like the outcome. We may not like the fact that they delayed and that they were late as compared to other provinces. Conversely, we kept schools closed for a long time, and they tried to tell us that it was just based on the science, which obviously was not the case. They were making a balance. We know we like the outcome, but to say, as they often did, and it varies between premier and between country, that they were just following the science is sort of to treat the public as being a little bit naive, because it was manifestly not the case. And so what we find, and what the argument we try and make in the paper is, it's not that we want decisions not to be based on the evidence. On the contrary, but at the same time, we want to make it very clear that we make the premier and our politicians are clear about who's advising as opposed to who's deciding.
So is this a conversation, Patrick, that is happening? Obviously, I mean, many people have used the analogy that they were building the plane while it was flying, right? I mean, we think back to March, April, May, June, even into July. I would argue even probably the full year, right? That for that full year, it was very much trying to construct this thing while we were up in the air. So from that perspective, it was very, very challenging. But where I get a little bit nervous is that when we think about, different lobbying groups have, different pots of money. What I wouldn't want to see is that one lobbying group or one sort of get the attention of government because they have more resources than another, right? So that's another big piece of this puzzle. There was people that had the ear of the premier and the ear of the prime minister, or all the premiers and the prime minister at the time, that many ways sort of helped guide that when the science was at the heart of it, and they were relying on the science. But why does one province close so much earlier than the other, and why did one province open up so much earlier than the other, right? So at the end of the day, that was challenging for so many people.
It is challenging, but that's sort of how I got into this in the first place many years ago. The science, at least in theory, the science is the same for all provinces, right? They all have more and less access to the research as it's coming out. And yet, time and time again, and we saw this during the pandemic, governments make different choices and different policy mixes. They do things early, they do things late. That's always the case. So when a politician goes before the public and says, well, I'm just following the science, if you remember the public, you might ask yourself, well, hold it. Why is Quebec doing it earlier or later than Ontario? If you're just following the science and the science is the same, that makes no sense. Well, the obvious answer is it's because it's not just about the science. It's about balancing a variety of considerations. But you're absolutely right. It's not about making decision-making science-free. On the contrary, because you're right. Otherwise, we then are left with wondering, well, who was the most effective lobbyist? But it is about making sure that responsibility for decision-making lies with the people who we elect to make those decisions. At its extreme, in our research, we found that in some jurisdictions, the politicians used it so much, and Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom would be an example, Premier Kenney in Alberta would be another. They used the phrase follow the science so much that the public actually got confused, and in Alberta, people began to wonder, well, hold it. is the chief medical officer the one making the decisions? So that's an extreme example of where this can go too far. But you're right. Ultimately, the science is a bulwark against just really effective lobbying. But our research was focused less on that than on what happens when it's overuse, not its underuse.
Right. And also, what we've learned, and I've asked this question of many people. I don't know who's doing the deep dive into the postmortem, if you will, on what's happened. Like, I don't know who is doing that. Is there? I'm asking you. Is there some group? Is the government? Is somebody looking back on how everything was handled to have the learnings for, dare I say, Patrick, another pandemic?
Well, that's a very fascinating. I'm delighted that you asked that question, because I just was at a conference for the last couple of days where this question came up repeatedly. So in the United Kingdom, they launched an inquiry. It's held its first public hearings this week. Sweden had an inquiry, and it was started and it's completed. But in Canada, for some reason, no provincial government has committed to a full-blown post-mortem lessons learned. There is a truncated version, a highly politicized version in Alberta. And so, the question arises, so are we going to systematically go back and ask what we did right and what we did wrong and what lessons can we learn? So the civil society organizations, community groups, think tanks are starting this process. So here in Ottawa, over the last couple of days, the Institute on Governance and the Institute for Research and Public Policy started the process. But ultimately, this is a pale version of what we need, which is a full-blown inquiry mandated by governments. Because when we had, for example, here in Ontario, the first SARS crisis in the early 2000s, we had a judicial inquiry. There was various committee reports. That was a much smaller scale crisis and disaster than the COVID-19 pandemic. It stands to reason to think. But people are actually divided on this question. A bunch of your listeners, I'm sure, would just prefer we just stop talking about the pandemic because everybody's just really tired of it. And that's true. There's no question. But it's like, there's the old saying, don't waste a good crisis. It seems to me vital to try and learn the lessons.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember early days that even the crisis, the pandemic of 1918, that we were even looking back there, what happened, what's the history there. Not that there was going to be a lot of lessons there from the perspective of how technology had moved forward, but still looking back, I mean, whether there's, and I hate even putting it out in the universe, but if there was something that happened in 20 or 30 years from now, there's still going to be lessons learned. And anybody that's listening right now that lost a business or has a child with severe mental health issues now because of what happened, that, believe me, they want to know, did we do the right thing?
Exactly. And the downside of a premier saying, well, we're just following the science. Let's take the example of school closures. We have good scientific evidence on what will limit the spread of the virus. And a lot of that evidence was put forward to the Premier and the Cabinet. What we didn't know, and what we still don't really know, is what are the medium to long-term effects on kids who don't go to, can't be in school. And so we need to do a post-mortem and ask the question, how do we structure the decision-making so that we get the balance right, that we don't privilege certain kinds of evidence, certain kinds of science, certain kind of considerations, and forget others.
For sure.
And so same thing with closing businesses. British Columbia had business closures for a fraction of the days that Ontario did. Why? Mm-hmm. What difference did it make? Now, it may be that the pandemic was worse in Ontario than in BC. That's one possibility. But it's also possible that the government overshot, that they went, as one does when one is making a decision in a crisis. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. We have to go back and ask, so let's look at that more closely. The other thing, though, that's really important is in our research, we found that this use of the phrase follow the science was highly variable. So the government of Canada was much more disciplined than, say, the Ford government or the Kennedy government in Alberta. And so you'll recall that Theresa Tam would have her press conferences on Friday. There would be her and her deputy, and it was mostly about here's what we know, and here's the latest information. The policy announcements today my government is announcing were for the most part made by either the Prime Minister or the Minister of Health, and that's appropriate because then no one's confused about who's responsible. Whereas in other provinces, especially in 2021, in Alberta, for example, the chief medical officer was like this chief government spokesperson. This really gives the impression that, oh, you're sending a scientist or a doctor out to tell us what's going on, then it's a science-based decision, when in fact, by definition, it was not.
Patrick, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have to go. I honestly could talk to you all day.
I much appreciate you asking these questions.
But thank you.
They're incredibly important.
Thank you so much.